Welcome to the show. Welcome to TeaTime. Welcome to Death of a Game, Guild Wars 2 edition. We've got a very special guest today, the detective himself. It is Nerdslayer.
The thing that I've always noticed about Guild Wars 2 is that the bones have always been good. And so that makes it so easy for the game to either stand the test of time by comparison to most games or implement changes, because it means that like when they implement changes, people actually want to see the game do well because they know that there's a core there that's actually like good.
Is that I feel like the best PvE is basically fake PvP, right? Like the boss you're fighting against.
Totally agree.
It should be like a player is controlling it.
We talked about early on this eSports thing. I think that was a massive blunder. I think if they could go back in time, they should say, fuck eSports. Let's just make it fun parody PvP. Different modes, different like, you know, seasonal things, put more of the effort into like getting the initial like bare bones, the replays, the rank systems in there, and just slowly build it and make it fun.
I get a little bit tangential to this, but I'm just super curious on your opinion, actually, as someone who has a lot, you know, is looking at a lot of different titles, a lot of different games, and so on. Like, where do you see Guild Wars 2 in the market right now? Like, where is it positioned? Like, where do you see it in terms of is it competitive with like the other like really big MMOs? Is it a little bit quieter right now? Is it going up? Is it going down? Like, where do you think it's positioned? Hello, gamers. Welcome to the show. Welcome to TeaTime. Welcome to Death of a Game, Guild Wars 2 edition. Yes, that's right. The game is dead, and we're here to confirm it. We're here for the post-mortem. Of course, I'm joking this time around, but we've got a very special guest today, the detective himself. It is Nerdslayer. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me again, and it's been a while and probably more my fault than anything, but I have a lot to talk about, and I'm sure you do too, as we were talking before. So
yeah, absolutely. And
good to see everybody.
Yeah, I think a really good place to start would actually be a little bit of your history with the game, because of course I don't, you know, many people will know your content for covering a wide variety of games, multiplayer games specifically as well, I think, but also big Guild Wars 2 player back in the day, actually, specifically for PvP. So give us a little bit of the details on that. What the hell was going on back in the day with Guild Wars 2 PvP?
Oh, man, this is I love telling the origin story of that, because I feel like it's in many ways, as many of us who've played online games can say, in some ways like a part of your story as a person, your identity. And so basically it was like 2011, and I went to PAX, and at PAX, which is like a big event that, you know, they hold in either Boston or Seattle, and it's like a game show, game convention. And they had like big MMO. This is back in 2011. I know it's sad, right? But like in 2011, they had like 3 big MMOs there. It was The Secret World, Star Wars: The Old Republic, which is why I was there. But then Guild Wars 2 actually was there too. And I remember being shocked because like Guild Wars 2 at that point was basically like hush hush. People knew it existed. People were kind of playing it in friends and family, but like I couldn't get in yet, so like I didn't know much about it, and like that was like the big chase, because like early on with Guild Wars 2 at that exact PAX show, for example, they showed off the World versus World, and they were talking about how it was inspired by Dark Ages of Camelot, and Jonathan Sharp was there, and I think Johansson was there too. A couple other big names were there, and they were talking about PvP and how it was going to be a big title for PvP, including actually esports, which was pretty shocking to us, because like for me, for the history that goes slightly before that, the condensed version, I played Guild Wars 1 at launch, and then I played all of the expansions too. So I mean, if you total the amount of time I played in Guild Wars 1, it's easily over 1,000 hours, but I wasn't like the biggest PvPer in that game. I actually was a pretty big grinder, just like to kind of play with my friends. But with Guild Wars 2, like when they talked about esports, at that point I started getting interested in PvP. So I was like, well, you know, WoW had this like esports scene sort of like arena. So I was like, maybe it could work. Like that would be awesome. Like to be able to play MMOs, which were my favorite game and what I spent the majority of time playing. And so the big initial journey was actually to get into the closed beta. So I didn't get an actual invite like to behind the scenes closed beta, which is what a lot of early teams were getting. And so that just made me even more like fired up to get better at the game. So for people who remember this, early on they did restricted testing. That was open beta testing. So it was like 3 days you got to play every couple of weeks or whatever. And this is a big reason why Guild Wars 2 summoned so much hype, besides all of the trailers and cinematics, but it was also like they were letting people slowly play the game, and we could all just feel that the game was amazing. I mean, because the combat's great. I mean, we never played a game that felt like that before, especially for Guild Wars fans. It was like the first game didn't even have jumping. So it's like, you're playing the second game even early on. I'm telling you, the first time I ever played the game at PAX, which was like 2011, late 2010, it was buttery smooth. And I remember just being like, this game could be an esport. This game could be esports. This game could be big PvP. I just, I could feel it then, because it was just like nothing else felt like that. And so I would slave over basically trying to get into every closed beta weekend or open beta weekend and play. I mean, I'm talking 30 hours in the week. So between 2 to 3 days, I was playing 30 hours. So that's basically like how, whenever the game came out, although I wasn't in closed beta, so I wasn't on any teams, I already had a lot of like playtime. So when I started playing with players, they were basically just like, "Who the hell is?" Because at the time I was going by a really edgy name. So all of my names growing up were really edgy and gaming. Like the first one I ever had was Obliterator, but I spelled it wrong. and it was Obliterator was how I spelled it. And so by the time I got to Guild Wars, I was like super edgy, so I named myself Exiled Force. But then I was like, but that's too long, so I went with X Force. And I don't know, I thought it was really cool. It's so funny in hindsight, because it's like I could see where I was going with it, but it was like, no matter what, anything with exiled and force in it, or exiled something, it makes you seem edgy. And so I named myself X Force. And to get discovered in a non-existent esports scene basically meant playing with the streamers. And so the streamers at the time were Earho and Fantaram. And there was like Crip was streaming, but he never PvP'd. He just did like PvE primarily. Crip was still streaming at that time, which is crazy to think about. But he had monster numbers when he would stream Guild Wars. But he got banned, if y'all remember the whole story there. But yeah, so anyway, so I would snipe Earho and Fantaram. And for people that don't know what sniping is, when Guild Wars 2 PvP came out, it was as bare bones as you can get bare bones. I mean, like literally, it basically just had normal games, and that was it. And you could queue as a team, but there was no elo matching. There was no like specific team queues. There was no like specific, like, let's queue in a lobby together. There was no tournaments. There's none of that. Custom games, none of that stuff existed. And obviously that was like a big negative for us, because we all expected to have at least some of that stuff. Not just because like they said that they would, because people say that, but it was because Guild Wars 1 had a lot of this stuff already. And so we kind of had this expectation of like, well, you guys don't even have replays yet. You guys don't even have this yet. You guys don't even have this yet. But we kept grinding anyway. And I'll tell you that the initial SPVP scene, the structured PvP scene, was massive. It was huge. It actually was so big that we would constantly play against new players I never heard of, guilds I never heard of, people I would never see again. But the problem was it had a massive hemorrhaging, because there was no rank systems. And so these poor players are having to play against grinders like me who, by the time that the game came out, I counted it up. I played 1,000 games. So basically by that point,
versus total new people, it's going to be a bit tough.
Imagine, it's like I felt so like people talk about being good and stuff like that. My story in Guild Wars 2 early on is actually kind of sad. It's like we would feel bad for some of these teams, because we'd be beating them 500-0, and I mean, in a point-based game, that means they're not even getting a kill, which is it's not very fun. People would just quit the game. And so it was just like, that was the early SPVP scene. It was very Wild West. People were just getting destroyed left and right. There was no kind of like rank systems. But needless to say, all of the initial players that went on to win championships and win the tournaments, they were all there. All of those players were initially there, like Team PZ and Curse, obviously the team that I would create later on. But like many of those teams, like they were there, and those initial Team Liquid had a team Legacy. There was another team too, like a French team that was a professional team. So there was like these teams that were coming in early on before they even had any of this stuff. And if you're wondering how we would play, all of that was said to explain. That's what we would snipe each other. Sniping is all you could do. So you you would look
You'd
at
have to
the
queue up at the
timer
same time, yeah.
and just queue up at the
Yeah.
same time. Like it feels so cringe in hindsight when I say it, but it's also kind of funny. But it was like,
Well, they didn't
I
have
would
anything
do
else,
that.
right? There wasn't anything else you could do,
True.
really. Like, you know,
I guess I'm more cringe that I used to do it to streamers to get in their lobbies constantly. And I know that people do that now in Battle Royales and it's obnoxious, but it's like back then it was like, you know, there was no way to get discovered, right? It was so all the teams that were coming out kind of already had like established players. And if you're wondering why, it's because they were usually gladiator players from WoW. Many of these players in these early teams, Spo was like a 4 or 5 time glad. Like they had like these kind of players, and obviously I don't remember all their names because I don't really care about WoW PvP that much. But and those players weren't even the best players in the end. But the best players were just the Guild Wars grinders that grinded from the beginning. But well, I know Grim is a really top player, but Grim didn't even play whenever we were playing. So that, you know, we didn't have these individual talent players that came out of nowhere yet. So we had a couple of teams here and there, and we would all queue with each other and play against each other. And it was I mean, I don't want to say pretty, it was super competitive. Like these teams, like we knew what top 10 was, even though there was no rankings. We'd play each other all the time and scrim each other all the time. So there was a lot of fierce competition going on. But the problem is that there was nothing that was kind of like happening from Guild Wars in. So like we were kind of waiting for things, and they ended up coming out with the custom system, or at least the rank system, I think about a year or two later. So like you have to think, we're grinding every day. A year feels like an eternity. And so that was basically what happened is that for many of us, teams just disbanded within the first 3 months. And it was because you can't keep up with that level of grind to stay at the top in a game like Guild Wars 2, which was like this, you know, super competitive game. And, you know, obviously I'll talk more about kind of like why, but like it was super competitive. It was like nothing really was like it. Like even WoW, you know, gladiator players were getting shit on. And it was because it was a totally different game. It was like your reflexes mattered. You actually had to be doing things precisely. And so it was like you combine that with the fact that like teams back then, you know, I know it's unheard of for people now. They're talking about ranked, and play now is very solo queue based. But like back then, it was all team based. Like solo queue was what you did when you had no choice. Everyone was teaming back then, before we even had team systems. So unfortunately, the team systems came in, and by then, I would say probably I watched at least like half the teams die. And I mean, like if we're talking about a competitive game, you know, a 5-6 person team, that's a lot of players, right? I mean, you think about that. That's, you know, thousands and thousands of hardcore grinders, or at least PvPers who are willing to get into the mix with people. So that was kind of like the whole story. Was like early on we were kind of waiting for things, but that being said, I still wanted to make a career out of it. So I was playing a lot on stream, and how I got noticed was actually on Airho and Fantaram's stream. And it was basically because I would play Necromancer, and back then nobody was playing Necromancer. There was only one team at Team SS in Europe who, in the early closed betas, was winning every tournament basically. They had a Necromancer, which is where I kind of got the idea of it from. So the European scene was aware of Necromancers, but the NA scene wasn't for some reason. And so like there was like no top players for playing Necromancer. So part of that attracted me to playing Necromancer. The other part that attracted me to it was that, as you kind of mentioned off stream, is that our early gameplay was very kind of like power focused. And so like, because people didn't really understand conditions yet, and nobody had the frame of reference, because no other game does conditions like Guild Wars, I promise you. Like it's very unique in how it handles boons and conditions, like no other game I've played. It's my favorite game that handles them. But so nobody even knew what like comboing was, and like how to like create more healing and area of effects, and like all that kind of stuff was very early on. So the Necromancer, as you know, because you're a Necro Lord, has so many comboable things. In fact, it has arguably with a staff like more than most classes, and safely. You can break and combo a lot of things relatively safely. You don't even have to get onto the point. You don't even have to get close to somebody and actually really land anything on them. If you're playing with big marks, for example, with your staff, it's going to be pretty hard to miss. If your marks are unblockable, going to be pretty hard to miss. Like these little things. And so early on, that was like the meta. The meta was basically the Necro was the Condi Necro was as vanilla as you could get. But my favorite part about the Condi Necro, and this is the one thing that I can always take to the grave, even though it's pretty much useless and nobody really cares, is that the Condi Necro is my build, okay? I created the Condi Necro. You guys can go back and look at the history books. You can go read my guides that I created back in 2011 and 12. The Condi Mancer, the one that people hate a lot of the time, that's my build. I created that shit. And for people wondering, how did you create it? Well, first off, Epidemic, that was my idea, okay? I made Epidemic get nerfed. Nobody was even touching Epidemic before I was playing that in meta. And then on top of that, Corrupt Boon, people didn't even know that Corrupt Boon could get rid of stability yet. So like you have to think about it. Like when I pulled Corrupt Boon out, people were like, what the fuck is this? Like you can stop my book when I'm Guardian, or like you can stop me from rezzing when I'm, playing whatever class. Like, so things like that were like kind of like my knowledge coming from the previous game, but just being an MMO lord that I was just like, I spent so much time into before the game came out, min-maxing and trying to figure out how can I make the Necromancer better. And so what I noticed when I was playing was that power was good, but it was stoppable. And conditions were very hard to stop. In fact, I still that way. Even if I play vanilla Condition Mancer today, still really easy to beat people. And it's because people don't account for conditions, especially in solo queue. Mind you, I'll skip to the end of the story later, which is that all the teams started countering me, so I got shit on. But anyway, y'all don't need to know that part of the story.
Yeah, that's fine. We don't need to talk about that. Yeah, I mean that's the story. But yeah, so please continue.
No, but basically it was just Necromancer wasn't really like a thing. So now everyone's more familiar with Necromancer power conditions, and so back then you kind of had this like a little bit of like a knowledge advantage. For people that are familiar with card games or competitive games, you know what like matchup percentages are, which is like everything that you play versus a certain matchup is based on percentages. So it's like we would duel so much in Guild Wars 2 early on that I knew how to beat every class. And that was just because I was playing with the best players. Like for example, shout out to not just Fantaram, but there was another damn, what is his name? I'm forgetting right now. He won the tournament as he played as the Elementalist in the tournament, the massive tournament that Guild Wars 2 had in eSports. Can't remember his damn name, but he was actually on my team in Curse, and Zeus. It was Zeus. My bad. Sorry. So it was Zeus. Zeus won the tournament. Was a guy I recruited. Was a guy that I put on my team and said, hey man, you should go play with these guys, who went and won the tournament. But like, not to say that like that was me, but it was because that was the talent that was in the early pools. Like we already had like the best players who went and like won the tournaments and stuff like that. But it was just like, we didn't really have a whole lot of things for them to really do. There wasn't really big tournaments going on. And so just eventually a lot of the players just got bored. And then what also started to happen, which is where my story becomes less flattering, is that the bunker meta started to become a thing. Oh, no. So the Necro, the Necro, initially, I was able to create a build that utilizes the focus and Corrupt Boon and even a well, if you want, to strip a lot of the boons that Guardians would introduce. The problem is that that's not the only thing that they would do. They were also incredibly hard to hit. They would also block a lot. So it was like certain things like that, for example, they could block my Corrupt Boon. So like really a lot of things made it harder to counter, and the Guardian players got better. And I'll just give full credit to Team PZ, who won the tournament, by the way, later on, but the first season tournament in ESL. But Team PZ, I have to give them credit for basically, they made the bunker meta like a thing. Like everyone kind of knew about it, but those guys were running 2 bunkers. And so it was like basically impossible to ever beat them quickly. And for people not really sure what that means, because they don't understand Guild Wars 2 PvP, to give you like a quick explanation, because it was conquest based, it's basically like King of the Hill. You get points for killing people, but ultimately speaking, if you can't kill a player, you're not going to get points from them. If you can't get him off the point, you're not going to get the points back. So essentially that was the strat, was hunkering down as much as you possibly can. And again, before the subsequent expansions came in, which added a lot more burning effects, which burning, by the way, for those who aren't aware, is the most OP condition in my opinion, besides things like Torment, because you can't strip burning. that like it's hard to manifest burning, but you can't strip it. Think about it. How can you get rid of it? Like unless you already have effects that are placed on the ground. If somebody plays, for example, I think it was recently considered OP the last patch, but like or the last expansion was the condition mancer build where you played with that new spec and then you ran the torch and you could actually play with fire. And I would play that on ladder and destroy people all the time because you can't get rid of the fire. The fire is OP. So needless to say, the conditions, the power has always been there, even before Torment, even before these newer conditions, which are definitely better and more useful. But like before then, we still had like some conditions. And so the Necromancer, I had some ability to kill players. But once the bunker meta was introduced, it was like me, the guy that was supposed to kill these guys, I couldn't kill them anymore. And it got worse than that because the teams that played against us knew that in order for condition spreading, even if you're playing without epidemic, to really work, you have to play with your team. It's hard to just spread conditions solely on your own. So they found out that my team was playing with confusion. That's what we were destroying people with. Was early on you could spread confusion and it was still OP back then. So you could still spread confusion and people would, to your point earlier, have massive power attacks and kill themselves basically because their attacks are so strong that they would have X amount of confusion stacks and then just murder themselves. So again, it worked for a while, but once the team started to realize, wait a minute, we can just bunker off and play one or two classes that their sole job is to kill the Necro or to stop him. And one of them was actually Ranger, is really effective at killing the Necro. The Ranger, for some reason, I don't know, maybe it's just when they created the class, but it's like when I would play against the best Rangers, basically they could just right click and run away from me. Like, I mean, there's no way that I can really kill them in the end. And so it was like, that was one way that people were killing Necros, but the other way was just straight up, putting some kind of effect down on the ground or press, like an elementalist was when it got big at the time, because it was like basically people realized you could just switch to water and suddenly you don't have an issue anymore. And I knew that sadly already because I told you I was playing Zeus one-on-one and Phantom one-on-one, and these guys were shitting on me as a Necro because there's no chance you can even stay, like your conditions can stay on them long enough when they're constantly stance switching and getting rid of your conditions. So all of that stuff combined basically killed the Necro and ironically killed the meta at the same time. Just And so yeah, that was kind of the end of my story. Was like at that point it was like I could keep playing and obviously we could change and like get different strategies, but I kind of made this decision of like, do I want to keep banging my head against the wall to try to beat the bunker spec, or was I just too like kind of like angry at the whole situation? I was too angry at the situation because the problem was yes, like the rage for sure
activated.
Well, what was also, it was like directed, and sadly, I've seen this happen to other esports, and people are aware of this too in their respective games that they like. But what happened is like I realized that it's like, in order to stop this, the other players have to also realize it's a problem. So in some games, they have GAs, things that you basically remove from competitive play because you think they're too OP or they're not fun or they don't make for the game to be more exciting. Yeah. Was I salty I was losing? Yes. but I felt like I had a really good argument, which is I would try to tell these players, again, Team PZ, who would go on and win the next championship. They didn't listen to me clearly, but like I would try to tell them, hey, like if we keep allowing this bunker meta to manifest, we're going to kill the scene. Like nobody's going to want to play this game because they don't understand how to either beat it, or they don't want to actually learn how to beat it, or they don't want to play the same thing.
This was a really interesting thing, actually, because what you're describing like happened a lot in Guild Wars 2. And I think this is where, as a game company, you do have to be really careful with listening to competitive players. Because, of course, in Heart of Thorns, it got even worse. Like, Bunker Chronomancer got added into the game, which was literally unkillable. In fact, there was a very famous Twitch clip, actually, where... in a competitive match, it was in a tournament game. One team literally left the minute that the other team capped a node even once, right? Like the game had like 3 minutes of nothing. One team was able to capture a single point, so the score was 0-0, right? One team got 1 point, the other team immediately left because they knew it was unwinnable because the Bunker Chronomancer was there. And the thing is that I actually spoke to one of the one of the pro players, a player called Lord Helseth, who's a very well-known Mesmer player, in fact, in Guild Wars 2. And he told me that the devs actually asked the pro players, should we nerf this build? And you know what? The players said no. That's the thing. They said no because they were winning. Right? And this is the issue with competitive players, right? At the end of the day, competitive players want to win. And I don't blame them for that. I don't fault them for that whatsoever. Look, if you're winning, you know, they want money, they want the clout, right? They want to have the competitive experience and get that victory. But yeah, sometimes the dev does have to say, no, this is actually ruining the game and we need to remove it immediately, right? Otherwise it's going to obliterate the scene, which ultimately that was certainly a part of it, right? I think there was a lot going on with PvP sure. and why it kind of shifted away because, you know, I think people really forget this actually about Guild Wars 2. But to be clear, Guild Wars 2 was originally going to be a very heavy PvP focused game. PvP and world versus world. That was the end game. That was what Guild Wars 2 was presenting to its player base. It's only when we kind of got into the expansions with Heart of Thorns that there was that more shift towards PvE away from PvP, and eventually the decline of the eSports setup. So it's a very interesting history with regards to that as well. I mean, I'm very curious. What do you think, especially as an insider? Like, what are some of the key factors you think that kind of contributed towards, I guess, the decline of that PvP element, and perhaps even just the overall hype? I think one thing that's really interesting, if you look back at the history of Guild Wars 2, is that on launch, everyone was raving, right? You know, I think Angry Joe's review is incredibly famous, right? Where he just said, wow, this game is absolutely sick, right? What an awesome game. Total Biscuit was talking. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Again, like everyone was in on this. And then it kind of just fizzled, right? That's my impression anyway. What do you make of that? What do you think happened there?
So one thing I want to say before I forget, which is something that I actually meant to ask you before, was you talked about the whole scenario with the developers giving the players like questions and then like, so I don't know what happened to this player, but I actually used to play with a player on a team called AC, Alpha Collective. They were like an early like nerd clan that, you know, had like a couple of, you know, names or whatever. Well, one of the players on that team would go on and play on Team PZ later on. But the crazy story about this guy is that I knew him, I played with him. He used to play like a thief. He was like a very high kind of mechanical player. After he realized that the bunker meta was a thing, he started playing bunker. That's not the crazy part of the story. The crazy part of the story is he got hired at ArenaNet and was a PvP manager and developer. And I don't know whatever happened to this guy, but I remember that he loved the bunker meta and told me that I should play it because it's the best way to win. So there's just stories like that, unfortunately, with early balancing in Guild Wars 2 PvP, where it's just like, I don't think I've ever even said that story publicly, but it's like, that's a real story. Like, his name was AC Power. His name was Power. And he literally joined PZ and then went and became an actual developer. And yeah, it was pretty crazy. But anyway, to address your question, so I would say that it's actually like, you know, my series especially, like, and I think that I noticed this with your content too, whenever I watch, is like, it's easy to just jump into like the easiest, quickest things that come to mind and be like, these are the reasons. But I think that it's always more interesting and more helpful to really like kind of like examine, especially if you've been there, try to look at the history. And I really like that you acknowledge that like Guild Wars 2 was supposed to be this big PvP game originally. When I was at the theater show, they were up there presenting a PvP game. Like, that's what they were presenting. Like, it wasn't like even like hardcore rating, and they didn't even mention that stuff. They mentioned world bosses and like world story, but like they didn't even talk about like dungeons and raiding yet. Like, that we didn't even know that was a thing until later in the betas. So early on, it very much was that PvP experience. Now, what I think kind of happened is I actually think that like the original developers, like we spoke about off stream, are, I mean, most of them are legends. They're very intelligent and capable people. What I think is very possible that happened is like they might have seen these kind of things start happening, like player retention dropping, player counts dropping, and maybe either because of NC Soft or because of their overhead rules or plans, they kind of told them, look, this isn't the focus for right now because we've already put so much of a focus into like world versus world. So like we want to kind of like flesh out these other parts. So I think that that could have been a thing because like especially some of those PvP developers, I know some of those devs early on. Like Jonathan Sharp was like a longtime dev on Guild Wars 1. Like these are like devs that weren't like shit devs. You can't say that they weren't talented at what they did. So I think that that was part of like what it was, is like it's almost like they saw it start to happen, but it's almost like they didn't maybe necessarily know how to plug the holes immediately, or they couldn't plug the holes immediately. And to your point about the population and the kind of hype dying really quickly, I think it did. I don't think it's talked about enough, but I think Guild Wars 2 is the most hyped MMO that I've ever seen. I've never seen a game that had more advertisements, more push, more this is going to be an amazing world-ending game. Like they really sold that.
It was
And
the
I
WoW
think what
killer, right?
happened-
People were saying it was kind of the WoW
Really?
killer almost. Yeah, that was kind of the impression that I think a lot of people were getting. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. And so when I played it, I even had that experience. So it was like many of us were like, this is going to be the next thing. But I think as many people experienced at launch, there was issues with the live content. There was a lot of server issues. We were getting DC'd. Like we were kind of getting our experiences ruined basically. And so in their concept, I mean, many Guild Wars legends and nerds will agree with me here. So I'm not saying anything controversial, that Living Story was kind of a failure, right? Like it was kind of a failure initially. And I think the issue is that people either expected it to be bigger than it was, or it's just, we didn't expect that level of like dispersion or like disruption would happen during the process. Because I remember so many people complaining that they couldn't play, that they were missing this, that this was happening. And it was just like, they were complaining about stuff like that. And so it was like, to your point, you talked about the expansions bringing in more of that PvE content. I think that's because they kind of realized like, we need this now. Like, because one thing that players don't understand about world content, and Living Story was very much this thing, is like Guild Wars 1 didn't have that problem in the sense that like a lot of its content was pretty instanced, right? So it didn't have to worry about like, let's do everything in this big, massive open world, and like the dragon comes down here and it does all these things. Like that sounds awesome, but the truth is, guys, like for the players out there that don't know development, it's hard to do that stuff. It's hard to make that stuff. And the number one thing that developers have been learning the hard way with MMOs is that to keep sustaining that level of input and content and new zones and new worlds, it's really difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but only like 3 or 4 games have done it so far. So, and they've basically been like the biggest companies and the biggest games. So it's like, I think that was a conscious thing by them. And in fact, I've said this on my stream before, that I think it was a good decision by them to kind of realize, you know what, we need to pivot off of this and kind of make content that I think is a little bit more sustainable in the long term. Like I talked about with you, something that I think that the game actually did get later on is more sustainable content. That being said, that stuff started to kind of, I guess, throw wrenches into the whole world of PvP, because suddenly it's like, well, how do you make sustainable PvP content when you're lacking all of this content? It's like they started plugging holes, but the problem is like as they were plugging holes, they didn't really have the best communication about it. And for people that don't understand what this meant for the players at the time, I was there. Like for many of us, we were sold that this game was going to be like an esport. And so like it was like when we started getting basically no communication about basic mechanics, that was like really worrying, because it's like, well, is this the same game anymore? Like what? And then suddenly the first expansion comes out and you're kind of like, okay, well, there's some PvP stuff in here, but it's like, this is a PvE expansion. like the subsequent expansions, these are PvE expansions. And you start to feel like, obviously it took many years to get to that point, but like it wasn't overnight, you know. It was like they saw most likely that like their PvP audience was, I think to your point, not getting an influx of new players coming in necessarily. And so they might have had like consistent numbers, but they could look at that as like, that's not going to make us money in a long-term scenario, especially like, how do we get these players to buy an expansion? It's, you know, besides the classes, right, and the new abilities, it's a little bit harder than selling them PvE content, especially when that's kind of what they expect. So I think that it was like this conscious like developmental decision for them to kind of shift their game. But I'm also not going to give them complete, like, I'm not going to give them bail. And I'm also going to say that, like, I think it was mishandling and not understanding that, like, had they actually cultivated that PvP scene a lot more early on, the thing that people and developers don't often understand, but more so you can see them now understand even in games like Final Fantasy recently, is that PvP is the most sustainable content. Like you might have your opinions about it, you might hate it, you might whatever. It is more sustainable. And it's sustainable because it's like if you and I want to have a duel, we can hop on a bunch of different classes and like have different fights. And there's a lot of parity there and a lot of differences. And we could really commit to that and still have a lot of fun with just one player without not having any other teams and all the objectives and all that stuff that constantly brings in these new environments and new scenarios and new fun things versus PvE. It's like, unless you're just trying to get more DPS sometimes, why would you keep doing the same thing? If you've already gotten your
You
legendary
need new
gear,
stuff. Yeah, you got to keep new stuff
exactly.
coming. And
Exactly.
ultimately, you know, it's kind of funny actually because I would say that Guild Wars 2, it's had a lot of shifts in direction. This is probably one of my major, I wouldn't say criticisms, but I guess observations about the game and maybe why it's had some difficulties over the years. It's because they kept kind of changing it, right? In the core game, it's like, yeah, we're going to do PvP in World vs. World. When they did Heart of Thorns, it's like, okay, yeah, we're going to do raids. Look, raids, here they are. Go, 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 right? Go in there and have some fun, right? Then when Path of Fire came out, they thought, oh, actually, that didn't really work, did it? Now we're going to basically focus on a lot of exploration and story content, and then they said, actually, we're not going to do that. We're going to make some other games instead. We're going to do some other unannounced projects. Oh, whoops, they all got cancelled. I guess we better make Guild Wars 2 again, right? Like the game it almost hasn't ever found its rhythm. It's been a bit unbalanced, right? Throughout its history, I think, and I think a lot of that does come down to actually the core game, right? Perhaps not working out quite as they planned, right? And the fact they had to change their direction somewhat radically, and they had to try out a bunch of different things. It's definitely a really interesting development history to look at from that perspective as well. It's like super, super interesting in that regard. And, you know, kind of something that's a little bit linked to this. You know, you talked about how PvP was bare bones. I think that was kind of true of quite a lot of the game in some sense, actually. With World versus World 2, the reward structure was not
For sure.
wasn't really a thing in World versus World. PvP, I mean, it's so weird to me, right? Like launching PvP without a ranked system. Like ranked got quite a while, took quite a while before it got added in. Hell, look, even proper ranked with actual rating, like an actual proper rating that you can see, that was even later. That was like really relatively late.
No,
into
you're
the
right.
game,
They had ranked,
right?
aka like rewards based system.
Yeah,
but it wasn't like full ranked yet.
yeah, and you know, it really strikes me as interesting because it's like, wow, like no wonder they had difficulty retaining players in PvP when the system just was like totally unfinished, right? Like it wasn't even close. And I think you're absolutely right on the communication thing there as well. And I think this, to kind of give an example that kind of sums this communication thing up, I think, yeah, there was one season of Pro League, I believe, right? And this is another funny story that I heard from the pro players at the time, is that they didn't know if there was going to be another season after that. That wasn't communicated. And I imagine it was because ArenaNet hadn't decided yet, of course, but like that's kind of like what an unusual position
But they also had a
in.
contract with ESL,
Right.
so it's probably like a matter of like they didn't know if they were going to get picked up for another season.
Yeah, and like that was, again, super interesting. That's not a position that you can be in as a pro gamer, right? Like you need to know if, should I still be playing? Should I be grinding? Like, is this over? Like what's going on? Right? But they didn't know. They had no idea what was going on, right? And this was certainly many of the issues that kind of plagued the early kind of eras of Guild Wars 2's development, for sure. Very interesting game. But, you know, it did hang on, right? Like Guild Wars 2, you have to give them some credit on this. It really has stood the test of time, right? I think lesser games would have died for sure, right? I don't think that there are actually that many games that would have survived the bumpy journey that Guild Wars 2 and ArenaNet have had actually over the years, to be honest.
I mean, to go back to your point slightly in that sense, like you could basically make 3 games out of Guild Wars 2. And I feel like that's pretty crazy to think about. Like you can have this raid-centric game out of it. You can have the open world game and you could have the PvP arena game. And it's like, now when you look at it in that context, I think it's hard to even debate that. Like, yet maybe are the scenes as active in every single aspect? Are they as like active as they could be? Is there as much content there as there could be? Of course, like maybe, I don't know. But I still think you could look at Guild Wars 2 and still say it still has these 3 kind of like pillars and way you can play the game. And I feel like a lot of games these days are kind of losing that in a sense. They're either losing the open world PvP, they're losing the arena PvP. the PvE is getting worse and it's not like that exciting. Point that we kind of made off stream was that the thing that I've always noticed about Guild Wars 2 is that the bones have always been good.
Mm.
And so that makes it so easy for the game to either stand the test
Yeah.
of time by comparison to most games or implement changes, because it means that like when they implement changes, people actually want to see the game do well because they know that there's a core there that's actually like good. And it's like I know many people that they would never say that the combat or the gameplay in Guild Wars 2 is bad. That's not their issue with the game. That might be not why they're playing the game anymore. So I think that that like sole thing being there, I mean, it keeps the game playable for basically forever, and as long as they, you know, even if private servers, whatever in the future, like whatever, like 20 years, 30 years, that kind of game could stick around because it has a good core foundation, and the core foundation is highly interactive and skilled. And I think that like, you know, that kind of goes into like, you know, the whole PvP thing, like why doesn't it work necessarily, in a sense of like the combat system in Guild Wars 2 is like the best way to describe it is it's probably, besides like maybe Arcade or maybe a couple other combat systems like that. And I say arguably because in those systems, unlike Guild Wars 2, your reactions don't matter as much. And I think that that's what's so unique to me about Guild Wars 2 system is they basically made a fighting game and nobody really talks about it. But like Guild Wars 2 is a fighting game. Like you really can fire your abilities off quickly. You can interrupt other abilities. You can cancel abilities really quickly. There's a lot of like the way that the game actually happens, especially at the higher levels in PvP, is like you and I talked about even off stream, like so a player that goes into that who's new, who is not exposed to that, it feels like they just got like knocked out and like, you know, whatever. Like it's like this big um, rude awakening of an experience. And it's because the combat system really does allow you to do so much with it. And this also applies to PvE, but obviously I'm less experienced there. And I'm sure you've talked about that a lot as well, which is like, it basically makes it to where in MMOs, typically like tab target MMOs, people will think that these games have no strategy. There's no, you can't be like good at these games. Like people would talk about that a lot back in the day because there's no reflexes, there's no reactions. But tab target MMO games are big brain games. That's how I describe them. They're a game about anticipating what somebody's going to do. Now, for people that wondering why is that relevant, Guild Wars 1 was about as tab target of a game as you could fucking get. You couldn't aim at all in that game, you couldn't jump. Everything was about facing your target and pressing your abilities that were like almost like it felt like a slight delay in your character because like the animations aren't very crisp in that game. So it was like what Guild Wars 1 was all about, and I played GVG and managed to get a bronze cape. So I know a little bit, is that like it's all about your team comp and how you play as a team together and making reads. For example, I played a split ranger who had an interrupt ability. My whole playstyle was trying to catch the fucking monk casting guardian or casting his like heal ability. And it was literally just like you have to fucking plan in your brain like, okay, as soon as I see him cast it, boom. But the reactions we're talking about, I used to think as a kid it was fast. You watch it back, it's like 2 seconds, it's like 1 second. It's like these are long for competitive play. That's a lot of time. So it was like Guild Wars 1 was this slow, methodical game. What's crazy about Guild Wars 2 is they took that and they did the complete, almost like opposite in a sense, and that they made it free form. It feels like a fighting game, like I said, like you can actually have combos. And a lot of the combos that people created, by the way, weren't really even necessarily intended. Like we just kind of like created these combos because we realized like these things fit better than what they wanted us to do with their abilities. And so you start playing it differently. And so I think that kind of stuff is why the game is still today a great game for anyone to pick up and try, is because essentially like even if you're just PvPing or PvEing on your own, if you're just playing with your friends, or if you do try PvP in whatever context, if you just slow down your like record yourself play sometime and watch it back, like I made that joke with you earlier that like that's the problem with the PvP in that game, is that you can't actually understand how amazing it is because it happens so fast and so abruptly in a sense. So it's like the PvE, you can see a little bit more of it, especially if you've been doing the same encounters over and over again, right? You can kind of like get your timings down, make sure your rotations are okay, even though that's less of a thing than, and you know, wow, these games that are very rotate, like it has to be perfect rotation, this. It's like Guild Wars 2, there's this more openness to it. And I think people like that a lot because it makes it feel like it's like you're not getting penalized for not always pressing the right button. It's more about pressing the right button at the right time. And that feels like unique in that game, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And a bit of a, I guess, like a side topic to this, into some other games here. What do you think? Is this like a big part of what you think separates Guild Wars 2 from, say, other games that have fallen? Right, we've seen many MMOs. I think that one that people were really hopeful for was WildStar, right? Like that game was a lot of hype around that. People were very excited to play that, of course. Unfortunately, actually fully dead. That one's not even just kind of, a low player count. That one's actually full on dead. Of course, we saw recently New World, although I would actually say New World has kind of managed to recover itself surprisingly well. Actually, I have to give credit to the devs on that. But obviously, New World had a lot of difficulties there, and also, interesting enough, very radical shift in development, of course. They're like, would you say there's a big difference between Guild Wars 2 and these other games that have kind of allowed it to avoid having death of a game Guild Wars 2 made about it?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, one thing is for sure is like ArenaNet is a different kind of company. Like even though there have been instances where they've been kind of more under the boot, if you will, of NCSoft, like ArenaNet has always been this kind of like special, different kind of company. And I'm not just like gassing them up. I say that because like they have this mixture of like wanting to get things accomplished, but also wanting to like create art, and you can kind of feel that when you play their games. Like I really do feel that way about that. So that's an element of it which can't be understated, is that like you really have people working on the team that care about Guild Wars as a franchise. I mean, some of the devs that have worked on the team I know have worked on it for 15 years. Like they worked on the original Guild Wars one. So obviously some have come and gone, but like I think that like the passion is there. And I'll just tell you, like, my personal experience with New World is that that just wasn't really there. I think that the problem with New World was that they had this initial idea of what they wanted to create, and ironically, it has a lot of similarities to Guild Wars 2 in that they've radically shifted the game many times. The difference being, which is why it's probably a great comparison, is that Guild Wars 2 always had the core experience as good. Even when I was angry, broke, and spending way too much time playing Guild Wars 2, I still loved the game. It was never like, okay, well, this is like an actual bad game and I don't want to play this anymore. Or this is kind of boring, or there's certain aspects of the game that I could pick up on that were issues. Well, in New World, I played it pretty heavily in alpha and beta, and I was able to figure out exploits in that game relatively easy, including movement exploits, like animation canceling, being able to like do swaps before they made it harder to just swap between all the staffs that you can just run endlessly. Like certain things like that were easy to figure out, because it's like, well, Guild Wars 2 is the kind of game that it's like you can figure stuff out, but you can't really break the game in PvP. I mean, I've played a lot of PvP. I've almost maybe on my hands seen like weird broken kind of scenarios, like doesn't really have, the game is really solid. Like the mechanical parts of it rather are solid. They work, they fire off, they make sense, the rules work, if you will. And New World, so the reason why New World doesn't is because the engine that they use is a modified engine that they took from essentially an offline game. So that happens a lot in engine development. But the problem is that I know from the developers on the team who told me over drinks that like the development they spent on New World was primarily spent on the engine. So people talk about New World's 5 years. Not really. It was more like 2 years, It was like maybe even if you talk about the post changes when they changed the game and kind of like put it away, maybe 3, It's like you can't really say it was 5 years, because it's like 2 to 3 of those years, I know from literal sources that work there, was spent on the engine. And in fact, the guy that was in charge that was talking to me and talking to me about this stuff, he doesn't even work on that project anymore. He got moved somewhere else on Amazon. And so what I noticed in that respect is that like the core of New World isn't as good. I mean, for example, I can show you guys how to basically exploit in that game that there's no use to doing it, but like I could just tell you, like basically whenever you're running, they used to make it to where the game was more kind of physics and momentum based. So like if you're running in a direction and you go to turn around, you would actually have to kind of like slow yourself down. And there's like this element of like weight to your character. I loved it. Like leveling in that game was really fun. I actually enjoyed it, even though there's a lot missing. Like the core of the game felt like it was good. Well, for people who didn't play in beta, and I know you did, they changed it actually, and they made it actually a lot more arcadey. And I think that that was because people were complaining about how hard it was to aim,
Yep.
like to get headshots,
Oh.
and people were complaining about stuff like. So basically, they ruined their own game, and I don't know
Ah.
why. Like
Ah.
I complained about it endlessly in my New World video, but it was like. But like I've never played a game that after beta and launch got worse. But I honestly think it got worse in terms of the core gameplay.
Mm.
And so now what you can do because of that is because the momentum is lacking in the physics engine, you can run forward, turn around, and run back into the same direction. So basically like stutter step yourself 3 times, and what you'll see is your legs will like glide on the ground, and you'll kind of like, you know, and it's because like you can tell that they made this change, but they didn't fully actually like iron out all of like the differences there. Like that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, sorry, doesn't exist in Guild Wars 2. Like
the
you don't have
foundation.
stuff like that.
The foundation has to be good, right? And I think you completely nailed it there, 100%. Like it's super hard to do. You know, I don't think it's. I'm not gonna go. Oh, New World, what an amateur mistake! You didn't make your
Right.
game good, you fools, right? Obviously, it's super hard to get that right. But yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. Like, I think, you know, you've said exactly this, right? Like the bones of the game are good, right? And that means that even if things go a little bit wrong, the game will probably still be fun, right? You know, it's like, it'll still be fun to play. It'll be a good core experience to have. And I think that is definitely something that really sets Guild Wars 2 apart. And has certainly kept players engaged in the, you know, very much in the long term, right? I think it's genuinely remarkable how well some of the scenes have survived, right? I mean, of course, you know, PvP and raiding and world versus world, they're all, of course, not quite as massive as they used to be earlier on. I would say that Heart of Thorns in particular was like was certainly a bit of a golden age for a lot of those game modes, and maybe a bit more in core for PvP, to be honest. But that's when it was really at its peak. But honestly, these game modes have survived even though they really haven't had that much dev attention, have been kind of semi-abandoned. And a huge part of that is because at its core, the game is fun, right? It's cool, right? There are still world versus world guilds that play every day, right? Super active core communities that have been here since the beginning, right? Or have been here for years and years and years and years and years, right? Despite world versus world being, until recently, of course, with the new renewed focus with the world versus world alliance system coming up, hopefully relatively soon TM, the game was basically abandoned, and there are people still playing it, right? And you know, there are still raiders, right, who kind of started playing and got into raids with Heart of Thorns and so on, and they're still going. It's because the game at its core has a very, very robust foundation that allows it to still, you know, still grab players and have them having a good time and returning, right? When there's new stuff down the line, right? You know, players may take a break and go and try some other things, like go try the new hot MMO that's coming up, or play WoW or Final Fantasy or whatever. But a lot of the time, because people just really enjoy that core experience, when there's content, players will come back at some point and then see what's going on. I think Guild Wars 2 does a very good job of that. And that's, yeah, again, because the core systems within the game, and I'd extend that to servers too, right? Like the way the servers work and so on. I think we mentioned this in the, you know, we do a little pre-tea time, guys, we do. But yeah, one thing that's really good about Guild Wars 2 is that even if the population goes down a little bit, your experience as a player will more or less stay the same because of the mega server system. There's always going to be people doing the open world stuff. Seriously, like, it is actually hard to be on your own in Guild Wars 2. That's actually true, by the way. Like, wherever you go, there's going to be someone, right? You're going to encounter a player, almost certainly. Like, even when the game has been quiet, this has been the case. You know, world versus world, honestly, it's always pretty active, right? Even if you're on a relatively quiet server that maybe doesn't have a big world versus world community, you'll still find people to play against, right? And there's people around. PvP, yeah, the queue times are a little bit up, I'm not gonna lie, these days, but you know, it's, you know, you can still get into games very easily, very regularly, and play matches, although, yeah, there might be a bit of a skill range sometimes, but overall it still holds up, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's always surprising to me, and you know, to flex slightly, like when I encounter people that are like higher ranks and ranked, and it's still easy for me to beat them, and I haven't played the game in ages. I still have the game, and I still like to play the game. So that just goes to show you that like the skill level in Guild Wars 2 is just insane. It's like if you've gotten to a high level before, yeah, you're a little bit rusty. You know, my timings are off, but it's like the knowledge is still there. I still know how the core of the game works, and to your point, I still really enjoy it. In fact, that's why I mentioned it is that like I've played BGs in a lot of other games even more recently, and it's really hard to like, even though I hate Conquest, I truly hate it.
Mm.
It's hard for me to not feel like I don't like the BG experience and Guild Wars more than many of these games. And I just feel like it's because, again, it feels more like a fight, right? Like when you're playing a game, like, wow, if it's like uneven, like it's like you kind of get stomped, like whatever, like that experience happens. Honestly, in solo queue, like in Guild Wars 2 and PvP, you don't really have that happen nearly as much. Like there's a lot more like what I would call like parity and kind of like movement in the skill levels within the team, meaning that like there's going to be one moment you could probably have some success if you kind of know how your class works. Maybe you get a couple of kills, maybe you do a couple of big plays. So you'll always feel like you're in the fight, you're involved in it, you're doing something, you're useful. And so even for players that I play with that aren't even the best at it, they still really enjoy the PvP because it just feels like nothing else is like that. Literally nothing else is like that. And I'm sure people feel the same way about raiding too. Is like really like there's nothing else that's like that. And Guild Wars 2 will always be a game that I return to for that reason. Now, one thing I wanted to say quickly is that I really hope that they could start to do some more wacky stuff with their game. Like, I do feel like they have the ability to, because that's kind of what we talked about off stream, is like, if they spent more time in thinking of novel ideas and how to solve some of their problems versus like just the traditional ideas of like create new content, create new things, I think that they could look at their game and realize that they have a lot to work with. Like, you know, whether it be like, look at what RuneScape has managed to do with their game, Ultima Online has managed to do with their game. These games have many shards and different server styles and different types of ways to play the game. And that's what I feel like Guild Wars 2 could also look at examining. Whether it be like right now on WoW private servers, this hardcore mode is like really big. There could be things like that. There's Iron Man modes. Like there's things that you can start to look at that it's basically kind of reskinning your game, but it's still fun and enjoyable. And I mean, I've talked about the one that I told you about that I personally enjoy, which is like I like that RuneScape has like servers and then PvP servers. So it's like if I just want to like go over to this server, I could just walk into town square and people are fighting and stuff like, and that's actually fun for me in those instances. I feel like Guild Wars 2 has this massive, beautiful open world. They should either add more world bosses, more world destruction with those bosses causing havoc that players have to deal with, or just allow players to have more conflict. But anyway.
Yeah, that will be an interesting one. You know, I think I think that sort of thing is maybe a little bit unlikely. I think ArenaNet like to keep the game modes very separate, right?
Like let's look at World versus World, right? Like, could you throw a dragon in there that suddenly is like a problem, or do
Well,
you
know
think
what's
that the people are
interesting?
too bored by that?
Oh, you know what's interesting? They did try to do this. With the Desert Borderlands, they actually added a lot more PvE to it. This is actually kind of this is a super infamous part of the game's history. One of the devs, I actually can't remember who it was, but one of the developers said something along the lines of, our players who play World versus World, they're big PvE players, right? And this statement was kind of a subject of great ridicule, actually, by the player base. However, they must have had some data behind that. And that's because they actually did add a lot more PvE elements to the new World versus World map that came out with the first expansion. But the thing is, they basically, everyone hated it and they ended up removing it, right? Pretty much entirely, right? They did try, because I think this is very much, you see this kind of thing in stuff like Classic WoW. I think Arcade had a lot of systems like this where you have to fight over a world boss. I think stuff like BDO has this too, right? Even New World originally did, right? Where you would have, you would have open world PvP and you would interact with other players and fight over the rifts and so on, to steal and compete for the resources, that sort of thing. Like this does exist, and I think they tried to make something a little bit like that, but it didn't really work out for them, to be honest, that much. And in fact, even more recently, they ended up nerfing a lot of the the bosses that kind of defend the keeps, right? Because people just found them annoying, right? They just wanted to fight other players instead, or at least that's the way it seems. But yeah, that's an interesting kind of a slice of history with regards to like PvE in World versus World. It definitely is a system that I think can be super interesting and can work, but it seems it didn't really work out super well in Guild Wars 2. I
don't really know what it was, because like when they would talk about it like pre-launch, they really wanted to lean into these aspects, but I'm not really sure if they just kind of didn't have enough time, or to really flesh it out back then, because I actually truly believe that had they introduced that stuff more immediately, which is like prepping your fan base for like what to expect and like what the game actually is capable of, I think that those things would do better, right? But it's like now like people are max level, nobody wants to level anymore, nobody's really leveling anymore, and so suddenly it's like we just want to fight because that's the best part of this game. That goes back to what we said earlier. Like the combat is so great that I can understand those players, because I feel that way with Warhammer, honestly, a lot of the time when I would play that game, which is like sometimes you're kind of just like, I don't really want to deal with the Keep Lord right now. I just want to fight against other players. And so I think a little bit of that comes from the fact that just PvE bosses at the moment just kind of suck. And I feel like if they're cooler, you don't see that same complaint. And my kind of like perspective on that is like, look at shooters at the moment. Nearly all major shooters have bots in some type of mode, and the bots they're pretty believable. Like, are they very good players, or are they gonna kill you 1v1? Probably not. But the point is like if you actually watch them and study them, they kind of seem like they're blending in. And I feel like that's the part that maybe the AI that we typically get just sits there and it's kind of just boring. It's like maybe it has a lot of health points, but there's not a whole lot of exciting stuff that's going on. And then sometimes it's just one boss, so it's just like it feels like it's like a detour from when you're doing PvP. You're like, okay, let's kill this dumb guy real quick, and then like let's get back to the show.
Yeah, I think this is something that's maybe a lot more possible, right? With I guess modern MMO technology, and this is something that I actually quite liked about New World, the earlier version of New World. It's a lot less like this now, unfortunately. Actually, is that I feel like the best PvE is basically fake PvP, right? Like the boss you're fighting against.
Totally agree.
It should be like a player is controlling it, right? Or that should be your goal as a developer, is to make it be a very reactive, a bit of, not this like scripted dance that you have to do. It's very much more like you're actually fighting a thing that's looking at what you're doing. It's got a certain set of moves, it has certain mechanics that it can do, and so on. And yeah, there'll be an element of scripting, as there always is with PvE, but it's something that is actually super dynamic. And I think that's something that there are some fights in Guild Wars 2 that actually do this pretty well in some of the raid encounters, some of the strike mission encounters. But yeah, I'm completely with you. I think that a big part of the rejection of this is perhaps the fact that it didn't blend in, right? It stuck out. It's like this isn't right. This is a PvP game mode, right? And perhaps if you do have these entities that are a little bit more dynamic and potentially therefore more interesting to that type of player, that is a type of content that could work. Because yeah, I actually think that again, the early versions of New World actually executed this quite well. But then it's weird actually. A lot of PvE players really didn't like it, and then they moved it to a more traditional like Trinity system, like which kind of broke that that idea of this slightly different, more Souls-like, right? Like Souls style experience that you were having in New World, which was their original vision, but not anymore. Not so much anyway.
Yeah, well, I think it was their original vision until they kind of started leaning away from the physics aspects of the game. And it's because oftentimes devs will do that because it's harder to make a game like that. And you made me think of something interesting with Guild Wars 2. Part of the problem with the game, actually, in some ways, is like the lack of the physics engine in some respects. Like, and what I mean is like if you've played Terra or even like some of these Dark Soul games, the PvE feels a little bit more engaged because there's more of like a getting knocked around and getting moved around aspect versus like this arcadey, you can fire your abilities off really quickly aspect that Guild Wars 2 has. So I feel like almost in a sense, it's almost like because they made the game so PvP centric, but then like kind of like tried to go back the other direction. It was hard for them to get players to really buy into that because like, I'm not trying to say that their combat system couldn't work for PvE, but it's more that like, look at which systems typically work for PvE. They're much slower. They're more about strategy. They're more about this kind of stuff. And like, Guild Wars 2 could be different there, but it's like, even look at Dark Souls games like that. They're slightly faster than most games, but even then, they're still relatively slow in how the movement and how the attacks work. And so I don't know if maybe that's part of it, is it feels too arcadey in a sense sometimes, where it's just like, unless you just know how to type your abilities or do your abilities really quickly, like you might feel kind of disconnected from that experience,
Oh yeah, no, I think this actually is, it's one of the concerns that I think a lot of Guild Wars 2 enthusiasts are actually super surprised about, right? I've watched a lot of content creators try out Guild Wars 2. For example, Preach is playing right now. Josh Drive Hayes, of course, has played a lot of Guild Wars 2 in the past. And you know what is super interesting? Is one of the things that comes up a lot is that they don't feel the combat has, they feel it's a little floaty. right? And this, and I understand what they mean too, because Guild Wars 2's combat honestly is really, really fun. It's incredibly fluid, very, very dynamic. But of course, there is a bit of a trade-off. Like they went very, very hard on that fluidity, and that means you do have a little bit of floatiness to it. It is quite difficult for the devs to kind of make it feel like something's connecting. Right? Yeah, it can feel a little strange sometimes until you get used to it, until you eventually end up appreciating it, of course. But yeah, there is something about it that I think can feel a little strange, right? When you're first trying out the game. Well, maybe, of course, you may simply not enjoy it, right? Like, nothing's for everyone, of course. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it is, and it's like I actually didn't know that was like something that other content creators had talked about previously, but it makes sense because it's like, even though I'm, it's hard for me to even say those words because I love the combat system so much and I'm such a fan of it, but I feel like that's partly because like I also love fighting games, I also love PvP, so it's like that combat system's kind of made for me, like versus like in fact, I played Halo 2 competitively for a while, and that game is glitch centric, so it's like I went from playing that game to Guild Wars to where it was like, it's not glitchy in Guild Wars, but there is a bit of that quickness of being able to fire things off so fast that it looks like it's janky. And that's the thing, is like Guild Wars 2 isn't really janky in the combat, but sometimes things happen so fast it makes you feel like something janky's going on, like you're like, what the heck just happened there? But it's like, it's just you almost can't even pick up what's going on because it happens so fast.
Yeah. This is definitely a concern that I have regarding the game. The game is like consistently sped up. I think this is inevitable. This is an entire other topic that we could dig into. But power creep, it seems like semi-inevitable, right? It's like really hard to introduce new things without power creeping the game in some way. But if you look at gameplay now, in PvE and PvP, compared to gameplay, say 5 years ago, like it is night and day. Like the game is so fast now, actually, in terms of button pressing. And I actually think this actually causes a lot of problems, even in PvE, right? Let alone PvP, right? I think that this is fascinating when it comes to MMOs, because I feel like other MMOs don't have this problem as much. Like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of the biggest issues that players have in learning the combat system is they can't press the buttons fast enough. And I'm not like roasting, but I'm not flaming it. I'm saying
I want to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead. But yeah, like the dexterity of pressing those buttons is actually a really tough skill for players who aren't used to that to get into. Yeah.
It is, and it's like I laugh because it's like I feel like people don't give it credit, like for people who don't play Guild Wars 2 or have never played it at a higher level, MMOs, for those who are not aware, combat-wise have kind of never really been the best. Guild Wars 2 managed to make a combat system that is very good amongst other games. So it's
even
like that's pretty exactly. So that's pretty impressive. But then with that comes sadly something that a lot of developers have even told me about, which is that something that they realize is that, wow, a lot of the players playing my game aren't that good, and that's okay. But the problem is if I made this game for really good players, it's like these other players aren't even going to see it. And so like the thing that I always try to explain to my audience about Guild Wars 2 and why like they'll say, well, you say it's like the best combat system, but how come it's not like the best game or whatever? Like it's not bigger than WoW, or it's not bigger than, whatever the metrics are. I'm like, well, I feel like it's because it's basically like the combat's so good, but it's like, it's almost like another language where it's like you're not actually understanding what's going on fully. And for the players that are used to having the right kind of mindset, I feel so bad for them. And what I mean is like the big brain players, when they play Guild Wars 2, it's a rude awakening. And like, it's especially like Guild Wars 1 players, where it's like they're used to doing the right things, which works in Guild Wars 2. Don't get me wrong. It's all about timing. It's all about doing the right things, the right reactions, the right specs, and the right matchups and whatever else. But the problem is what you said. You nailed it, which is just if you don't do it within 2 seconds or 1 second, you're already too late. And if you're already late by 1 to 2 seconds, that means they're ahead of you. And if they're ahead of you and they're the one that's trying to kill you, then you've probably already started losing. And the point you mentioned is like there's a lot more things going on to where it's faster. And then the point that you and I made pre-stream, which is that like there's less immediately being killed than there was initially, but there's more of the overwhelming feeling of you can't do anything about it. And I feel like that's actually more frustrating for some players, because it's like, sure, you get one shot sometimes, but it's like your point, like, you got bulls charged into like some kind of combo, but it's like, but if it happens and then like suddenly this whole other thing happens and the warrior does his fucking like ultimate with his sword and he's got the spinning fire or whatever, and like suddenly you're just like, I don't even know what's going on anymore. you might have the right plan in your mind, right?
But you got to
But it
pull it
just
off.
goes
You got to do it.
exactly. It
Yeah.
completely goes out the window. And to give you guys
Yeah.
like an example, I'm a martial artist, and this is actually super common in martial arts. So when I'm training like white belts, because I'm a blue belt in jiu-jitsu, but when I train, but I've been doing martial arts in general for a long time. And so when I'm training someone who's like new or a beginner, it's the same kind of concept exists where it's like I can tell them exactly what to do, what you like the perfect like plan. Like if you're playing Guild Wars, this is the spec, and you go hey da, 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 and you could read that and do it to a T. But then as soon as you suddenly miss the timing on something, I already saw that you're trying to do it in martial arts and I can counter you. So it's like that's happening in Guild Wars 2 as well in the combat system with the PvP. So
Mm.
for most players, they're just seeing either really fast abilities happen in front of them or the other players are thinking, damn, my plan didn't work. But that's not really the whole story. The story is your plan doesn't work if you don't do it fast enough.
Exactly. This is 100% a really big issue. And I think that this is one of the things that really causes players to have a tough time learning the game is exactly what you described. It's you can have the right idea and get absolutely destroyed, right? And you can, and then of course it's kind of logical to think, oh, I must be doing something horribly wrong, right? And a lot of the time it's, well, not really. You're just too slow, right? Is what's going on there. And I think that does make the game a little bit counterintuitive to an extent, right? It's hard to diagnose what's going wrong sometimes, just in the game in general, right? Like why did I lose? Why did I have difficulty with completing this? Or why did this guy kick my ass, right? In PvP, because it's not, sometimes it's not as simple as, oh, you need to use a better strategy, or, oh, you've got to watch out for this particular thing. Sometimes you actually have to improve your proficiency at pressing buttons, right? Which is, it sounds really weird, and almost, when you try and explain this to people, it's hard to say it without sounding a little bit weird and condescending, I think, but I
think so too.
It's super hard to communicate that, but it is a big problem in the game, right? Is that the actual act of controlling the game itself, piloting the game, is significantly harder than I think a lot of other comparable titles, right? At that base level.
Absolutely. And I think that to go further there, like when you compare it to other MMOs, it's fucking the skill cap in Guild Wars is astronomical. It's just insane to think about. I don't even think it's close to many of these other games. Maybe like old school PvP games like Darkfall, right? But that's a full physics engine PvP game. So you're basically playing Quake. Like so that's the next level of even Guild Wars. So that, by the way, they learned the hard way too. It wasn't sustainable because nobody could fucking play it unless you were a Quake player. Which luckily I was, but no, but with Guild Wars 2, it's like you know, doing the right thing strategically was what Guild Wars 1 was about. Guild Wars 2, I actually think, I haven't wanted to say those words, but I actually think that it is a bit contradicting. I think it's okay to say that, and I think that it is a bit of a mixed message, because it's like, as much as I want to sit here and say, even as an ex-PvPer, like, oh, like, you know, it's great this way, and I love it, but it's like, but really, when you think about it, if you're trying to introduce class identity and specs and team spec identity and strategy and synergy, when you make it to where the individual play is so reactive in that sense, you don't see that stuff as much. And it's because not that it doesn't exist. I played on a team, I remember it existed. It's because it's so much, it's happening at a way higher level that it's like you can't even pick up on, like, you know, like when you're watching someone do basketball, they run around over here, someone picks this guy, he shoots, you're like, okay, he did the play. It's like when you're watching Guild Wars, you're like, what the heck is the play? You don't know what the play is. And it's like, they have a play. They know where they're supposed to go. They have a combo. When they see something, there's a reaction that they're supposed to react on. Like that stuff's going on, and yet you're just missing it completely. And I actually want to say that I actually think a big reason for that is not just the combat system and their kind of like perspective. I think it's partly because they went anti and Holy Trinity in a sense. I think it actually does severely affect it. I love Guild Wars.
It's so open, right? Yeah.
But it makes it so hard to balance. I think them being less segmented in PvP and PvE balance was also an issue there. In Guild Wars 1, they were a lot more segmented, by the way. And I think that actually helped the games feel a little bit more balanced. Like, so certain abilities didn't suddenly become really powerful because they're introduced in PvE or whatever else in other contexts, to where like even like Epidemic, they had to nerf it in open world because it was like, then in small instances, this is like, okay, it's like not I mean, this is kind of cool, but it's like an open world. It's like, what the fuck? This is like overpowered. Like suddenly you're killing everybody. It's like, and so I think that that's an issue. But the other thing too is we talked about early on this esports thing. I think that was a massive blunder. I think if they could go back in time, they should say, fuck esports. Let's just make it fun parody PvP. Different modes, different like, seasonal things, put more of the effort into like getting the initial like bare bones, the replays, the rank systems in there, and just slowly build it and make it fun. For people that never played Guild Wars 1 PvP and probably won't because it's older, like the PvP in that game, guys, was so much fun. And it's because arguably compared to other PvP games, it has the most PvP content ever. It's why it's so funny. People always talk about Guild Wars 1. They're like, that's a PvE game. It's like, it has more PvP modes than any other game I've ever encountered personally. You've got random arenas, which after you win a random arena, then you get placed in team arenas, so you can play with other players, which just makes logical sense. And suddenly you win team arena, you get sent to the Hall of Heroes. You win Hall of Heroes, you can get different ranks and keep progressing up. They have PvP with PvE. They got PvP with just PvP. They got PvP on a map with objectives. They got PvP that's just deathmatch. There's so many ways to play Guild Wars 1 versus like when I go into Guild Wars 2, it's like I'm just playing basically one way if I'm not world versus worlding, obviously. Like if I'm playing the BGs, and I feel like that was like a pretty big mistake on their part, is not adding a lot more fun ways to experience the game to take away that edge, bro. You already have this competitive system built into your combat, like meaning it's already the super in-depth combat system. You have to, I know hardcore players don't like me to say this sometimes, but like, you have to make it easier. You have to make it more casual and more appealing to the players who are looking at that and they're just like, how can I even get in there? It's like, you know what Guild Wars 1 had? It had queuing up against bots. That was a mode. You could play against bots. You could train. You could go hit the dummy. Like there were these things that, some of these things exist in the Mist and whatever else, but it's like, but the playing against the bots and learning your skills as you played, you could do that in Guild Wars 1. I don't see where you're doing that in Guild Wars 2 unless people think that Guild Wars 2 PvE is the same as fucking PvP. It's like, it's not. You're playing a different game, basically.
Yeah. It's very, very interesting. Yeah, especially looking at the history of those games. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Of course, Guild Wars 1, it's very interesting now that you bring that up with like the history of Guild Wars 1, actually, because Guild Wars 1 almost had a very similar journey to Guild Wars 2. It's like ArenaNet just tried again, right? Because Guild Wars 1, again, very much started out as this I'd say PvP focused game, right? Like there was, of course, some basic PvE that existed, as often is the case in MMOs. But
the first expansion was a PvP expansion.
Yeah, I actually remember playing. I remember playing the beta, right, for factions actually, and yeah, like it was obviously like there was a lot of PvP stuff going on there, right? That was like that was what they were offering, right? That was the offering there. It was only later on when they started adding consistently more PvE. I think particularly in the Eye of the North, right? Like is when they added a lot of like PvE stuff, right? They had the PvE only skills, right? Because they were like, okay, we can't add some of this stuff to PvP. That's going to get crazy, right? And it's like Ada just did it again. They're like, you know what? We're going to do the exact same thing in Guild Wars 2. We shifted to PvE in Guild Wars 1. We're going to do the exact same thing in Guild Wars 2. We're going to try PvP again. So that's actually very.
I'm glad you said that because I've
always
banged on that drum. Seriously, like I've been saying that for ages. That I really feel like Guild Wars 2 is like them doing Guild Wars 1 again, except way bigger now. They're like, all right, let's do it way bigger now. But there is a lot of similarities there, but obviously some pretty big differences, like we've talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get a little bit tangential to this, but I'm just super curious on your opinion, actually, as someone who has a lot, is looking at a lot of different titles, a lot of different games, and so on. Like, where do you see Guild Wars 2 in the market right now? Like, where is it positioned? Like, where do you see it in terms of is it competitive with like the other like really big MMOs? Is it a little bit quieter right now? Is it going up? Is it going down? Like, where do you think it's positioned?
Like I'm gonna have like a bit of an interesting answer on that. Like I kind of feel like part of the problem there is with that question is like I feel like Guild Wars 2 themselves, like ArenaNet and the game, almost acts like it's like not a big player.
Mm.
And like, you know what I'm saying? And I know that they can't necessarily compete in certain respects, but I feel like even like the way that the content and like the communication and the advertisement around the game is kind of treated, I feel like it's almost treated like an old hat game still. And I feel like it's
Mm.
still pretty modern. It's still pretty new. Like the Steam stuff, I felt like showed that off, right? Like it can still bring in players, it can still bring in excitement. I feel like leaning more into treating their game like it's not going anywhere. I know it's hard
Mm.
because you might be thinking, well, we can't create as much content, we can't, but I just mean in terms of like the respect factor. I feel like
Mm.
people aren't talking about Guild Wars 2 in like the same respect as the other games. And I can't help but feel like by all these years, that's not just players. It has to be something that the game or the devs maybe are missing or maybe could focus more on. Maybe even just talking about the game in more reverence, if I'm being honest. Like I think to myself, like this game really is like fascinating in certain aspects that really are extraordinary. And I don't feel like that's talked about enough. Like even in modern context of advertising the game, the combat system should be on way more full display. I mean, no other combat system is like Guild Wars 2. So just little things like that, which are harder
Mm.
or easier to talk about, harder to execute. But I would say those would make Guild Wars 2 feel and seem like it's more of a major player. But I felt like it's almost like maybe because of how ArenaNet just does business, but they've always been treated almost like they're like an outside player. And I don't really feel like they are. I do feel like they are in the mix. So I know it's like a kind of complicated answer, but I feel
Mm.
like they're in the mix, but I feel like they haven't necessarily treated themselves like they're in the mix.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. I think one of the symptoms of this is one of the things that I get a lot, right, as someone who streams streams the game a lot, makes YouTube videos, is that people have like super outdated information about the game, right? Like the game and ArenaNet, they don't communicate super well where the game is right now. A lot of what people know about Guild Wars 2 is like where the game was 5 years ago, 6 years ago, right? Like a lot of people say, I didn't even know Guild Wars 2 had raids. That's crazy. That's wild. I thought this was still like a big PvP game, right? That's absolutely insane. Or even that, your classic, oh, the game is dead, right? Oh yeah, that game died ages ago, right? This game's still going, huh? And it does seem that ArenaNet struggled to connect this. Of course, this is inevitable, right? I think that when you have a long-running title, people quit and then they spread information. Not like, they're not being deliberately malicious there, but, they spread information and then that information propagates. So people often have outdated ideas about where a certain game is, right? I'm sure I could find plenty of outdated information about WoW if I ask Guild Wars 2 players, for example, right? All that kind of stuff. But yeah, ArenaNet really does struggle to present what their game is now, right? Like right now. For sure.
I like the distinction there.
Mm.
Yeah, I like your distinction there because I do feel like that's incredible. And in fact, like last year when I was playing PvP for a minute, what was crazy to me was I was going back and watching old content about kind of like things that they had changed and old videos, and it was like that actually happened to me where I was watching things that I realized were outdated, and I was like having to go watch other things, and it's like, yes, that's partly content creation, but it's also partly like ArenaNet needs to be better at disseminating that information basically. And in fact, your chat was making memes about it, but they're pretty good. And memes, like for example, they said Guild Wars 2 doesn't have Holy Trinity, and it's like that still is sold as like the thing for Guild Wars 2. It's like that shouldn't be like what they're selling. Or it's like Guild Wars 2 is jumping puzzles, and it's like, but that isn't really what Guild Wars 2 is anymore. It was that like 3 expansions ago. And so I do feel like there is a little bit of like they need to update their terminology and update how they're presenting their game and talk even small. And like people before they say, yeah, but they're small guys, I know even smaller games with even smaller teams that will still present like, this is what we have lately, chapter blah 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 blah, like and this is the new thing for the new chapter, and like it's more like up to date so you know what you're getting into. And I feel like that's a little bit lacking with Guild Wars 2.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very much the case. And I just forgot what I was going to say. Damn it! I just I got absolutely.
I'll fill in that
unlucky.
somebody
Yeah,
mentioned lazy peon. Yeah, no, you're good. And luckily, this is what people do in the biz, but we always help each other. But so MMO, someone talked about an MMO tier list that Guild Wars 2 was still voted up there with Final Fantasy 14. I think that perfectly encapsulates my point, which is like the love is there. The people like this game, but it's almost like they don't even know it's still around in some instances. In fact, I'll talk about it sometimes. People are like, oh, that game's still kicking. It's like, yeah, it launched on Steam. And it's like, I know people might be saying, but how do they not know it launches on Steam? Not everyone's following that stuff in the same way. So I think it is up to ArenaNet to not just throw a bunch of money and target ads, but also come up with like interesting content that's like looking back at the game and saying like, this is what the game was and this is what it's become. In fact, they could even do a video. I'm giving them a free idea here, where they could just go through the game and its expansions and show what that did to the world and what that brought to the game, and then show it in the modern context and be like, now we have all of this shit. Like, come play. Like,
I think this is especially true actually, as right now actually, the kind of the high ups and a lot of the developers are actually really good at being forward facing. I would say a lot of the ArenaNet team that's very important. For example, the game director Grouch, Colin Johansson is back at the company as well, and even in other areas of the game, like the skills design lead is a guy called Cal Cohen, CMC. Actually, an ex Guild Wars 2 player, right, turned developer Roy is now involved there, and these guys are amazing communicators. Seriously, they legitimately are. They are awesome. It's always a pleasure to actually just see them actually, you know, on camera talking about stuff, right? Talking about balance, talking about areas of the game. Like Grouch is pretty active on the subreddit. He visits a lot of Twitch chats and so on. These are very, very good communicators, right? And would be amazing at presenting the game. I completely agree with you. I'd love to see them do a little bit more of that and actually present the game as is. And I did actually remember what I was going to say. And actually, this is one thing that goes into like the Holy Trinity thing that you were talking about, right? I do think that one thing ArenaNet has always struggled with is that they maybe try to set themselves apart from other games in every instance, whereas maybe sometimes they shouldn't. For example, it is kind of technically true that, yeah, there's no hard Trinity in Guild Wars 2, but the thing is,
healing is going on.
Yeah, if you want to play a hard healer, you can. If you want that priest paladin style gameplay, yeah, it exists in Guild Wars 2. And I think that the way ArenaNet present it as, oh, we're not like the other MMOs, in a way it confuses people, but it also puts people off. If you want to tank in Guild Wars 2, yeah, you can 100% do that. If you want to be a pure DPS, yeah, you can 100% do that. Same with a healer. Like, if you want to play the game in a full Holy Trinity, you can absolutely do that. And of course, as it turns out, that's kind of how it plays out quite a lot of the time now these days. It's moved in that direction a little bit more. It's like a soft Trinity, right, rather than a hard Trinity, but it's still kind of present a little bit, maybe. So presenting the way they present that is like, okay, yeah, and they say, oh yeah, you know, they should say, oh yeah, we actually do have hard content. We do have stuff like the new strike missions, and you know, for example, I imagine you're familiar with the Mythic World of Warcraft scene, right? I actually spoke to Maximum, who is the kind of leader of Team Liquid's team in World of Warcraft, and I went over the latest fight. He was super impressed. He was like, "Whoa, this is crazy!" And I even had the again the raid lead for the main opposition to Liquid, Echo Scripe, was in my chat, also kind of curious about what the hell's going on, right, with Guild Wars 2. Like, that fight, this was a pretty, I would say it was a pretty unexpected addition to the game, but a fight called Harvest Temple Challenge Mode. It was a pretty brutal encounter, by far the most challenging thing ArenaNet has ever put out, and it was literally made for the best players, right? They made this to push people as far as they could go. Guild Wars 2 has stuff like this, right? But ArenaNet don't push it. Right, there are actually loads of really interesting things that maybe people wouldn't expect about the game that do exist. Yeah, sure, not as much as Final Fantasy, of course, in World of Warcraft, but it is there. There really are a lot of interesting things that the game does have to offer. It's just that ArenaNet, I wouldn't say they're ashamed or they don't want to admit that actually they have some other things. It's they seem a little reluctant to have anything in common with WoW. Like, I think this is a problem they've had historically. It's like, we are literally the anti-WoW. We're the opposite of WoW. But, you know, sometimes these games, they have good ideas, right? And of course, ArenaNet make a lot of new ideas and they innovate quite a lot. They have done historically, but sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes there's actually some really good stuff that exists in other games too, that you don't necessarily have to differentiate yourself from.
Yeah, I think, I mean, someone mentioned like Duty Finder. That's a thing. Like, obviously, harder instant queue modes that you can just press a button. Like, these are things that people might not have always been like cool and liking those things initially, but it's like now that you're at a mature stage of the game, it's like that stuff along with the communication that even it exists. Because I didn't even know that like harder content even was introduced. So like to your point that apparently it was even I didn't even know about it. And it's like I'm not like the Guild Wars 2 lord, but it's more that it's just like I'm somebody that probably should know about it. Like, like
Well,
I should have heard about it. And it's like whether or not it's ArenaNet's job to personally tell me, it's like, well, they should be telling people.
Yeah, to be clear, just to give you some context on this, they did not market it in any way. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. They did not really. Obviously, it was in patch notes. Obviously, like there was a post like, oh, look, here it is. It's coming. It's been added to the game. But they didn't.
Like 10% of people go to the forum. So I bet how many people read the patch notes? Probably even
exactly.
less.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, do you know what? One thing that was really interesting is that nobody expected it. So obviously, all the guilds went in. My own guild went in to try and clear it. And nobody was expecting it to be difficult. People thought, oh yeah, we'll kill this in like 2 hours, right? Like it's the usual, right? Just blast it, GG, easy peasy, right? And everyone was completely shocked because nobody had any idea. They could have said, oh, this encounter, this is going to be some serious shit. You guys had better get ready. You're going to get your ass kicked, right? That could have been interesting. And it was after the fact, right? After the fact, there were players from literally professional WoW players going like, oh, that's pretty interesting. I didn't know this game had that. Taking a look at it. They could have done that before, right? But they didn't. And this is something that is a little bit strange, like with the marketing of the game. Hopefully, maybe with some new leadership coming through, because of course there has been a pretty major restructuring of Guild Wars 2 and ArenaNet relatively recently with a slightly changed business model. Of course, new leadership with the new game directors and so on. Hopefully we see them do a little bit of a better job at this because, yeah, it definitely, it does really show. I think the tier list is a great example that you brought up, right? People do really like the game, but in a way, it's only people within the game who know about it, right? Like it's people outside the game are like, Omega lol, right? This game is dead. Like, if you just see like the reaction that you get about Guild Wars 2 in other MMO streams, I think, for example, I think whenever Guild Wars 2 comes up in Asmongold's stream, there's a bit of roasting that happens, right? A little bit of maybe a little bit of negativity towards the game in some of these other big MMO streams. But yeah, it is what it is, I guess. That's these things happen.
Yeah, and it does, but I definitely think that like public perception of an online world, I know it might seem like to some people like, why does it matter? Like just it's the game. It's like honestly, it's a world. So it's like the way I describe it to like my fan base is like essentially if I'm trying to like bring people to my store, I have to get them interested when it come inside. So it's like it really is about word of mouth and like if you're telling everyone, man, this place is amazing, like you should really go there. It's like that's what's gonna do it. But it's like even if it is good, if the word on the street is that it's not, that's all that matters, really, right? It's like people are gonna not actually see the quality that is there because they're hearing about all of the negative publicity around it. One thing I'll say too, which is not necessarily like helpful necessarily, but it's just my observations and even just watching recent trailers and content, is MMO developers are just not that great at marketing, and I don't really know why, but because I feel like the player base understands it, especially like really like loyal. I feel like they can understand it because they know what gets them excited, right? So they could tell you like, this is what I want to see. But the problem is like goes back to the old school player versus like the new player is like, you also have to have somebody who's making content for the new player. Always. You can't just ever stop that. And I feel like that's a little bit of the focus there has been lacking with Guild Wars 2. So that also contributes to that and the negative perception and feeling people have about it. It's like, well, it's not really focused for me and it's not really for me. So like, it's for these other players.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Like, I think in some sense, that's where the game's horizontal progression causes a bit of problems in a way, right? Because new players essentially end up playing very old content a lot of the time, which is not necessarily representative of how the game is now, right? And they tried to
I think even Final Fantasy has that problem too. Still,
yeah, with I think people always joke about this a little bit, right? Like how the story grind, it can be pretty brutal, right? If you're not ready for it, right? Like getting to the the game kind of gets better over time significantly, right? It's obviously a problem that a lot of MMOs face, right? And we've seen them try to tackle it in different ways. WoW massively reworked their kind of leveling experience and how that tends to operate these days, right? And other MMOs have a variety of tactics to try and handle it, but in a way, Guild Wars 2 has it the worst because they keep all of their content relevant. They're kind of suffering from success here. Like everything they ever added to the game it's still there. If you're a new player, you have to play through 10 years of content, right, to get to the brand new stuff. It's pretty wild. It's really, really cool in some sense because you didn't miss anything, right? It's all still there. It will all still be relevant.
Pick it up again.
Yeah. But on the other hand, it's like, wow, like well, I mean, I'm not going to say it's almost impossible. It is impossible for them to maintain all of it, right? Like they can't do it, and they obviously can't. Like, one thing right now that I think is a pretty major issue, we're kind of getting to boiling point on this. They're having a lot of trouble with bugs. A lot of trouble with keeping old content functional, and these things kind of slowly keep piling up. That there are a lot of issues in the game, right? I mean, there are certain, even open world bosses, class bugs, bosses with alt bosses, right? Instance bosses and so on from back in the day. Hell, there was even a story bug that still, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been fixed, but you literally can't complete one of the story instances right now because it's just broken. It's just gone wrong in one of the recent patches, unfortunately. And it's a big problem for them that they aren't able to maintain. Oh yeah, let's not even talk about dungeons. Now that is some broken shit. Yeah, like there's a lot of stuff that they really struggle to maintain. So
I even complain about dungeons. So I mean, I'll join right in there. I mean, probably for different reasons. My complaint about dungeons is the complaint that we're talking about with the new player base getting into the game, which is that like dungeons used to be really challenging, and then they kind of just made them really easy because people got scared about them. And so I feel like there's too much. There's a lack, just like other games get around this by just making their game too easy overall. Like, so SWTOR, when I play that game, it's so easy. Everything I do in that game is easy. Now, it's because they made the game easy, which also means that there's essentially no challenge in that game. Well, Guild Wars 2, you have this incredibly high challenge, but it's like they still have to make sure that they're making the game easier and making it more accessible for the player that's learning it. Because to your point, one thing I was told by one of the guys that recently had played the game for me was that like when they play Guild Wars, well, also actually one of the girls that was playing too, that they don't understand like really what the urgency of what they're supposed to be doing is. And it was because like it's almost like you're in there and it's like you start in the beginning, but they're just like, you don't know that like the content you're experiencing is like 15 years old, 12 years old or whatever, like the first like 1 to whatever experience. And so in your head, if you're forming that as like this is the basis of the game, then it is unfortunate. And obviously the solutions aren't necessarily easy because it's like the devs can be like, let's just make you skip to the end the end game stuff and like kind of like go through that, but then they just made their entire world basically useless. So it's like they don't,
right? Yeah.
They don't want to do that. So like,
especially not Guild Wars 2, right? Because that's a big part of how the game is.
Yeah, and so I think that there's an element of that too, but I think to go back to about the dungeons, it's like you need to make sure that when players are playing through the game, you're introducing the fun stuff and the hard stuff early enough. And I feel like Guild Wars could still do that. They could still be like, hey, let's just maybe once you hit this level, let's make you do this particular thing and try to make it more matched to like whatever the skill level should be for this given level. Again, this takes a lot more effort for designers to figure out, okay, well, what should we actually test? What should we be trying to teach players? Which content should we use? But I think that's probably better than just, basically waiting for them to try to see if they can even get to the end game and then be like, okay, now you can start actually learning how to play the game. I know a lot of other games do that, but I don't think Guild Wars 2 can afford to do that. I think it's actually one of the few games that can't afford to do that at all. You can't teach your player base in game because it's too late.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that's a very succinct way of putting it, because I think that's exactly what happens in Guild Wars 2 right now, actually, is that players go through the entire game and then they hit a brick wall when the devs throw something challenging at you, right? Like, this is what a lot of players have, is they play through the open world and through the story, and they go ahead and try a strike mission, or they try a raid, and they're like, whoa, what the hell is this? Right? I was smashing everything in open world. And then you get into PvP, or you get into, a boss or something like that, and it obliterates you. It destroys you because the step up is huge, right? Like, the difficulty curve for Guild Wars 2 is not so much a difficulty curve, it's a difficulty cliff, right? That you have to climb up when you get to the end game. So it can be really, really intense for sure.
Yeah. So I mean, all of that said, I love Guild Wars. I love Guild Wars 1 and 2. I think that they do things that are similar but also unique from each other. They're both worth playing, and I also think that
Mm,
there are still games that could come out
mm,
in the future that could learn a lot from these particular games.
mm,
Like I think that we will see games that are more like them in the future, for
mm.
sure.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
fact, I think that these are games that people will borrow a lot from.
Yeah. And I actually just want to quickly contextualize your perspective there because I think that was a fantastic perspective. But as I understand it, you actually have a lot of experience in this exact field, working with in QA, right? Like for video game
Mhm,
companies and AAA studios, I believe. So that's
mhm.
just to kind of contextualize what Nerdslayer is saying here, guys. This is not like this is actually like a proper um, a perspective that comes from direct experience in working in this exact field of how players interact with core systems in video games and so on.
Yeah, for sure. And
Mm,
also, even to go a step further, like we
mm,
mentioned off stream, I mean, NC Soft is even coming out with a new big game.
mm,
Like to even push it to that, like
yeah,
people know that Throne and Liberty is supposed to be coming out relatively soon in Korea, and then follow that
mm,
launch relatively shortly after, which is pretty rare for Korean launches and global launches for people not aware. In many cases, the most popular online Korean games took 1, 2, sometimes even 3 years to come to America. So an NC Soft saying that we want to bring Throne and Liberty immediately tells me that they think this is going to be comparable or palatable for the Western audience too, which tells me that it is a lot more like Guild Wars 2. And I mean, you can
mm,
watch the combat and watch the game itself. You can see it's a lot more action. It's like an action combat lineage in a sense. And I think that that's them trying to look at like what they've done before and be like, okay, how can we make this more palatable? If we make it a grind 'em up kind of game with that same kind of approach, that could have a longer shelf life or maybe attract more global players because that's the big thing with Guild Wars 2. And honestly, we don't even have enough time to talk about that. We should talk about that next time, which is like Guild Wars 2 is a Western game. That's
mm,
actually a big problem. It's a huge problem. And it's because the last time that NC Soft had a successful Western game, they killed it because they didn't want to deal with it anymore, basically. City of Heroes, they were just like, this game's profitable and successful, but it sucks in Korea, so in Asia, so we're not really, and they failed at launching it there, so they didn't really put much focus into it. So the fear there is that like if they launch, like for example with Guild Wars, it's like this is a Western game, so it's like what Throne and Liberty has the chance to be, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad for Guild Wars fans, depending on how you look at it. If you're a player and you just want to have fun, maybe it's good. If you're loyal to just the game, maybe it's bad, right? Is I think that Throne and Liberty is trying to take a little bit of both of that and
mm.
trying to be like Guild Wars, but still have kind of the more traditional MMO aspects, which to your point is maybe what Guild Wars 2 is kind of controversial about in some respects, right? Because it doesn't have those things.
Yeah, and that is super interesting actually, and I think that this is always something that I think is kind of in the back of your head as any MMO player, but definitely particularly with Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2, I think it has an advantage in the market because it kind of has a lot of features that other games don't do super well. Right, you look at the combat system, you look at something like World versus World, right? The way open world works, right, with like the really big world bosses and so on. There aren't that many games that really have that, right? In a way, like we talked about this earlier with the raids, right? Like, and with just the combat system in general, is that it's hard to replace Guild Wars 2 in your life. You know, if you quit Guild Wars 2,
Hmm.
where do you go? It's kind of hard to find it, right? There are a few
Hmm.
games like, I think you could maybe have a more action game like BDO or something like that, but obviously that's got some downsides to it, obviously, right? With going in that type of direction. And I think new MMOs coming out, it's always interesting to see if they're going to kind of take a bit of steal some of that audience, right? Like with people moving away and going to different games. I think New World, I was honestly a little bit worried actually about World versus World, that open world PvP element being very attractive to Guild Wars 2 players. And in fact, it was. I'm in the World versus World community. I'm aware of what's going on a little bit, right? At least. And yeah, a lot of World versus World goes like, dude, let's go. This looks awesome. Let's go play New World. Of course, they didn't, obviously we know how that turned out. But yeah, there was that element where people were like, yeah, this is kind of the game that we're waiting for that's going to replace Guild Wars 2 for us, or at least, remove some of those players there. So I think
Right.
it's very interesting to see like how these new games end up performing, and it's very interesting to hear that you think that NC is very confident in the success of this new title.
Yeah, and
Mm,
also like another element of that too is basically like people might feel, for example, I saw someone in chat said like TL has static tap target. It's more of a hybrid, and I think that that's what people
mm,
mistake about combat systems. Is like they're not always one-to-one one way. Like Guild Wars is not even fully action combat either. Like in fact, there are many abilities that will auto aim in that game, right? So these combat systems are better when they're actually hybrid, in my opinion, because they're a lot more appealing to broader ranges of players. So if Throne and Liberty feels less action, that could be a deliberate choice because they're using Unreal Engine, but they could be saying to themselves, you know what, let's not make it so reactive and fighting game based and make it more like a traditional MMO. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but we'll see. And I also think that what's really interesting layer about all of this is not just with Throne and Liberty, that's just one good example, but other future games is that the fans of Guild Wars 2 can always see what that game feels like compared to their game, and I feel like that will actually have a significant effect in the future. So like when the other developers can look and see that happen, they can look at this new game and be like, you know what, this game is actually not better than Guild Wars 2 in these specific respects. And that's why I still truly believe that people will look at Guild Wars 2 as the game that, you know what, let's take some of these aspects from it. I do believe it's one of the top 5 kind of like MMOs that developers are still going to look at it. If I'm making an MMO, I'll tell you that I'm looking at things from Guild Wars. I don't see how you couldn't at this point.
Well, yeah, I mean, other games definitely are too, right? And I think we see a lot of influence kind of creeping into World of Warcraft, for example, in the latest expansion, right? We saw the dragon riding, which is very much akin to what we see in Guild Wars 2, right? Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct in that. I definitely think that developers developers have a lot of respect for ArenaNet, I think, or Guild Wars 2 at least, right? Like, within that industry, there's definitely some things that are being taken from there. So, yeah, for sure, and I'm in complete agreement there. Like, I do think Guild Wars 2, in a lot of ways, a lot of its core systems, it's the standard, right? That's where you want to be, right? If you're making your new title, for sure. And I don't think there's a lot to be said for that hybrid hybrid combat system. I do think that ArenaNet were very deliberate with the way they designed this, right? I'm pretty sure that a lot of the core philosophy in the game, it wasn't just, it wasn't random. And of course it's not random, but you know what I mean, right? They were very specific with what they were going for, I think, and very deliberate with the design decisions that they took when they were building the foundation of the game. And, well, I think that really shows because of how well it's held up, even in this era of new era of gaming.
Yeah, and really, to finish that point too, like you mentioned about like learning things from other games, like Warhammer is the one that invented public questing. Like no other MMO I saw was doing it before that point. So essentially, Guild Wars took that concept, combined it with Guild Wars 1 and made a better game than both of those games.
And so, of course, the world versus world element, right, came from, or there was realm versus realm PvP that came from Warhammer as well, I believe, too. Yeah,
Warhammer, and then previously Dark Age of Camelot. So
of course.
They basically looked at this new like kind of sexy title in 2009 and were like, let's make like the better version of that, basically, and they did. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a pretty good place to kind of wrap things up. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to share with the gamers right now?
I mean, I think a couple of people had some good things to say that I would agree with, which is that, like, don't always feel like too scared or threatened whenever you feel like maybe your game's not going to be in the spotlight anymore or whatever else. Because the truth is that you can always go back to a game like Guild Wars and Guild Wars 2. And that's not something that a lot of other games can say. I mean, like when they try to go back to those games, either their game doesn't exist anymore, or it's not the kind of game that they can even go back to and play. And so I feel like MMOs are worlds and like other homes for us, but it's also like a place for us to learn and then take whatever we learn and experience into whatever the next experience is. So hopefully that doesn't mean that it's a completely other genre or IP altogether, because I love Guild Wars, even though it lacks the Guild Wars part, but we can talk about that next time. but anyway, so shout out to everyone who's playing MMOs in general. You guys keep the industry, of course, alive, literally, but also you getting more educated and having higher expectations. I know it might be annoying amongst your friends, but it's actually better for the industry, because you're going to be better able to tell people, hey, this doesn't work. I mean, I even tell you, like, one of the things I talked about in my New World video was about that. Was MightyTeapot telling me that New World economy stuff was kind of not so great in the beta. And I remember hearing that from you and being like, yeah, that's basically what I've been told by other guilds too. So it's like learning about the game and playing the game is important just for the sake of enjoyment and doing it and fulfillment, but it's also like you can actually take that now in the modern age with how easy it is to talk to content creators and developers and people, and you can actually affect change. Like, I know it's harder, but you guys being more educated and knowing what to expect and having expectations, it's better for all of us. So anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as a quick final thing, would you like to give yourself a quick shout out just to make sure everyone knows how to kind of check out what you're up to, what's coming up these days with everything Nerdslayer and Death of a Game? What's going on? Where can we find you?
Basically, my YouTube channel, that's going to be youtube.com/c/Nerdslayer Gaming, or you can just look up Nerdslayer Studios. And then I stream there on YouTube sometimes too, but then I stream dual stream on Twitch as well. That's Nerdslayer with 3 R's. But yeah, those are the places that I'm the most active. Oh wait, discord.gg/Nerdslayer. Yeah, those are the places I'm the most active, where you can either talk to me, ask me questions, or suggest me to cover a game or something.
Awesome. Okay, and of course, all of the links are going to be in YouTube. They're going to be below the stream as well. They're going to be all over the place, right? You can find them. You can get in on the action, and you definitely should. So yeah, and you should also follow the stream too. You know, do it. Okay, what an amazing show. I mean, if you're not following the stream, what are you doing? Wow, get in there. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, everyone, and thank you very much to Nerdslayer for hopping on board. I really appreciate it, man. It's awesome to get to speak to you, right, and get your perspective on the game. It was an awesome show. I hope you had a good time. I know the chat has appreciated. I've appreciated. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, appreciate it seriously, and I did have a great time. Thanks, guys.
Okay. In that case, for all my friends, we'll see you next time.